Hello and welcome to Daily Reflection with Aneel Aranha. Today is the 10th of September 2018. We're going to reflect on Luke chapter 6 verses 6 to 11. On another Sabbath, Jesus entered the synagogue and taught, and there was a man there whose right hand was withered. The scribes and the Pharisees watched him to see whether he would cure on the Sabbath, so that they might find an accusation against him. Even though he knew what they were thinking, he said to the man who had the withered hand, "Come and stand here." He got up and stood there. Then Jesus said to him, "I ask you, is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save life or to destroy it?" After looking around at all of them, he said to him, "Stretch out your hand." He did so, and his hand was restored. But they were filled with fury and discussed with one another what they might do to Jesus. The Gospel of the Lord. One of the questions I sometimes get asked is why Christians meet on Sunday instead of Saturday, which is the traditional Sabbath. I thought it might be a good idea to answer this question because it can come up at any time, and it would be helpful to know why. In the story of creation, we find God taking a day of rest after 6 days of creating the world. Remember? This formed the basis of the Sabbath, which was to be a day of rest for us too, and all Jews faithfully observed it. The Sabbath, however, is a sign of the Mosaic covenant. God has made several covenants over time, as you know, and on each occasion he gave us a sign to help us to remember this covenant. You will, of course, remember the sign of the rainbow he gave Noah, the sign of circumcision he gave Abraham. With Moses, it was the Sabbath. Now, the first thing we need to understand is that we are not living under the Mosaic covenant anymore, so we don't need to observe the Sabbath anymore. So it's not like we have moved the Sabbath from one day to another, we just don't observe it. Now, today we're living under a new covenant in Christ's blood. Jesus gave us the sign of the new covenant at the Last Supper, his body and blood, which is Holy Communion. Then he died and rose again on the third day, which is a Sunday. This came to be known as the Lord's Day and was set aside for him, which is the simple reason why we meet on Sunday. Several times in the book of Acts, we find the early Christians meeting for prayer on the Lord's Day. Before the turn of the century, this had become a universal practice adopted right across the church, and it is a practice we continue to this day. However, there's a downside to this practice. A lot of Christians believe that if they meet for prayer on Sunday, that is enough. Hey, it isn't. We should worship the Lord at all times. I mean, think about it. If there was somebody you loved deeply, would you set aside an hour in the week for him or her and say, hey, that's going to do? Or would you want to spend as much time as you could in their presence? And the other downside is that the rule becomes important, not the purpose behind it. It is what happened to the Pharisees. They were so fixated on following the observance of the Sabbath, they totally lost the plot. There was a man who was sick and had the chance to be healed, and they didn't want him to be healed because it was the Sabbath. We can see the absurdity of this, but unfortunately, we can be similarly blind when it comes to our own failings. So today, let us just pay heed to what we do and make sure they're not just ritualistic practices. God bless you.